When we observe the violent polarization tearing apart contemporary society, most analysts point to economic inequality, social media manipulation, or partisan politics. But these are merely symptoms of a far deeper malady, a spiritual disease that corrupts the very structure of human consciousness and inevitably manifests as political extremism. Having witnessed firsthand the rise of National Socialism in Vienna, I can tell you that political extremism is never merely political. It is always the external expression of an internal disorder, a fundamental deformation of the human soul that seeks to escape the tensions of existence through the construction of ideological pseudo-realities. The extremist, whether of the left or right, is engaged in what I have termed the immanentization of the echelon, the attempt to create a final, perfect order within history through human action alone. This is the essence of the Gnostic revolt against reality, and it produces the spiritual disease that underlies all forms of political extremism. Today, we see this disease manifesting in movements that promise to fundamentally transform society, to create new worlds purged of contradiction and suffering. Whether cloaked in the language of progress or restoration, these movements share the same Gnostic structure, the belief that human action can achieve what belongs to the transcendent realm alone. The stakes could not be higher. Until we diagnose the spiritual roots of political extremism, we will continue treating symptoms while the disease spreads. The recovery of civilizational order depends upon our ability to recognize and resist this ancient enemy in its contemporary forms. Chapter 1: The Gnostic Structure of Extremist Consciousness. Political extremism is not a deviation from normal politics. It is the inevitable result of a specific type of consciousness that has become increasingly dominant in modernity. This consciousness operates according to what I call the Gnostic structure, a fundamental deformation of human awareness that seeks to escape the essential tensions of existence. The Gnostic consciousness cannot tolerate the fact that human existence unfolds between the poles of time and eternity, immanence and transcendence, order and disorder. Where healthy consciousness accepts this tension as the very condition of human existence, the Gnostic consciousness experiences it as an intolerable burden that must be eliminated through the creation of a perfect intramundane order. Observe how extremist movements invariably promise a final solution to the human condition. The communist promises a classless society where exploitation and alienation will disappear forever. The fascist promises a racially pure state where conflict and degeneration will cease. The progressive promises a liberated society where oppression and inequality will be eliminated through social engineering. The populist promises a restoration of authentic community where corruption and artificiality will be banished. What unites all these apparently different movements is their shared refusal to accept what classical philosophy recognized as the permanent structure of human existence. They cannot tolerate the fact that perfect justice, complete knowledge, and final happiness belong to the transcendent realm, not to the realm of political action. This refusal creates what I call second realities, systematic deformations of consciousness that replace the complex reality of human existence with simplified ideological constructs. The extremist lives not in the real world, with its irreducible tensions and ambiguities, but in an artificial world where ultimate questions have been answered and final solutions are within reach. The psychological appeal of these second realities is obvious. They offer escape from the anxiety of existence, from the burden of making choices without perfect knowledge, from the responsibility of living consciously in the tension between time and eternity. They promise certainty where reality offers only degrees of probability, and they promise control where reality demands acceptance of limitation. But this apparent gain comes at a terrible cost. The price of escape from existential tension is the loss of contact with reality itself. The extremist becomes psychologically dependent on maintaining his artificial construct against all evidence to the contrary. This creates the fanaticism, the immunity to argument, and the potential for violence that characterizes all extremist movements. When reality persistently contradicts the ideological construct, the extremist cannot abandon his second reality without facing the existential anxiety he originally sought to escape. Instead, he must either interpret contradictory evidence in ways that support his construct, or he must eliminate the sources of contradiction through force. This is why extremist movements inevitably become hostile to free inquiry, independent institutions, and dissenting voices. These represent threats not merely to their political program, but to the psychological foundation of their existence. Chapter 2: The Civilizational Roots of Contemporary Extremism. The spiritual disease behind political extremism did not emerge spontaneously in the 20th century. It represents the culmination of a long process of civilizational degradation that began with the breakdown of the great ordering symbols that once provided meaning and orientation to Western civilization. For centuries, the classical Christian synthesis provided what I call ordering symbols, compact experiences of transcendent reality that enabled individuals and societies to live consciously in proper relationship to ultimate reality. The symbols of the polis, the cosmion, the corpus mysticum, and the civitas Dei offered various ways of understanding human existence as embedded in a meaningful cosmic order oriented toward transcendent truth. These symbols were not arbitrary constructions but articulations of fundamental experiences of reality. They enabled human beings to understand themselves as participants in an order that extended beyond the merely human realm, an order that provided both meaning and limitation to human action. The breakdown of these traditional ordering symbols created what I call a spiritual vacuum in Western consciousness. Human beings cannot live without some sense of meaning and orientation, but the traditional sources of meaning had lost their compelling power for increasing numbers of people. Into this vacuum stepped various substitute symbols that promised to restore meaning and order through purely human action. The laws of history replaced divine providence. The will of the people replaced the will of God. Scientific method replaced contemplative wisdom. Social progress replaced eternal salvation. These substitute symbols had one crucial characteristic: they were all immanent rather than transcendent. They located the source of meaning and order within history rather than beyond it, within human control rather than beyond human manipulation. This shift from transcendent to immanent ordering symbols created the preconditions for extremist politics. When ultimate meaning is located within history, political action becomes invested with soteriological significance. The political movement becomes the instrument of salvation, and its enemies become not merely political opponents but enemies of salvation itself. We can trace this development through the major intellectual movements of modernity. The Enlightenment's confidence in reason as the source of perfect knowledge and just order. Romanticism's elevation of feeling and imagination as guides to truth. Positivism's reduction of reality to what can be measured and manipulated. Historicism's belief that meaning emerges from the process of historical development itself. Each of these movements contributed to the erosion of transcendent orientation and the concentration of meaning-seeking within the immanent realm. By the 20th century, this process had advanced far enough to make large populations susceptible to the appeal of extremist movements that promised to restore meaning through political action. Contemporary extremism must be understood as the latest phase of this long process of civilizational decline. Whether manifesting as identity politics, populist nationalism, or technocratic progressivism, our current extremisms share the same basic structure: the attempt to create meaning and order through the manipulation of immanent reality alone. The intensity of contemporary political conflict reflects the depth of the underlying spiritual crisis. When politics becomes the only available source of meaning, political disagreement becomes existential threat, and political opponents become metaphysical enemies who must be defeated at any cost. Chapter 3: Recognition and personal participation in the disease. Before we can effectively resist the spiritual disease behind political extremism, We must honestly examine the extent to which we ourselves participate in the very patterns we seek to understand. This examination requires what I call philosophical anamnesis, the recovery of authentic experiences of reality that have been obscured by ideological constructions. Ask yourself, when you encounter political ideas that contradict your own convictions, what is your immediate response? Do you experience genuine curiosity about what might be true in the opposing position, or do you immediately begin formulating arguments to defend your existing beliefs? Do you approach political questions with the recognition that your understanding is limited and provisional, or with the certainty that you possess the correct answers? Most troubling of all, do you sometimes find yourself experiencing a kind of exhilaration when contemplating the defeat or humiliation of your political opponents? Do you derive satisfaction from news that confirms your worldview and feel irritation when forced to confront complicating evidence? These responses indicate the degree to which we have unconsciously absorbed the gnostic structure of consciousness that underlies political extremism. We may not consider ourselves extremists, but we participate in the same fundamental error, the confusion of our partial and limited perspectives with reality itself. The healthy consciousness recognizes that political judgments are prudential rather than metaphysical, that they concern the best available responses to complex situations rather than the implementation of eternal truths. It maintains what I call epistemic humility, the recognition that our knowledge is always incomplete and our judgments always fallible. But the diseased consciousness cannot tolerate this uncertainty. It transforms political preferences into cosmic principles, policy disputes into battles between good and evil, and practical judgments into revelations of ultimate truth. It seeks to escape the anxiety of living consciously in an uncertain world by constructing artificial certainties that cannot be questioned without undermining the entire psychological edifice. Consider how you relate to the sources of your political convictions. Do you trace them back to careful examination of evidence and patient reasoning about complex questions? Or do you discover that they are primarily emotional commitments that you subsequently rationalize with selective evidence? Most of us must admit that our political beliefs are formed more by social conditioning, personal experience, and psychological temperament than by dispassionate analysis. This is not necessarily problematic. Human beings are not computers, and practical wisdom always involves more than abstract reasoning. The problem arises when we forget the contingent and partial nature of our convictions and begin to treat them as absolute truths that justify extreme measures in their defense. When political beliefs become identity rather than judgment, disagreement becomes personal attack, and compromise becomes betrayal. The spiritual discipline required to resist this tendency involves the constant practice of what classical philosophy called examination of the soul. We must regularly question not only what we believe, but why we believe it, how we came to believe it, and what psychological needs our beliefs might be serving. This examination will reveal that much of what we take to be rational conviction is actually rationalized prejudice, that many of our strongest political emotions arise from unexamined personal experiences, and that our most cherished beliefs often serve to protect us from facing uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our world. This recognition is not meant to produce paralysis or relativism, but to restore the proper relationship between conviction and humility that characterizes authentic philosophical and political life. Chapter 4: The Historical Manifestation of Spiritual Disease. The 20th century provided a comprehensive catalog of how spiritual disease transforms into political extremism, and the patterns we observe reveal consistent structures that transcend particular ideological content. Whether examining National Socialism, Bolshevism, Maoism, or contemporary movements, we find the same fundamental dynamics operating beneath superficial differences. The key insight is that extremist movements are never primarily about the ostensible issues they claim to address. They are about the transformation of consciousness itself, the creation of what I call pneumopathological, conditions that make populations susceptible to ideological manipulation. Consider the trajectory of National Socialism. The movement's appeal was not primarily economic or political but spiritual. It offered meaning and orientation to populations that had lost traditional sources of meaning through the destruction of old ordering symbols. The promise was not merely better economic conditions or more effective government, but nothing less than the spiritual regeneration of the German people through the creation of a new type of human being. This regeneration required the elimination of what the movement identified as the sources of spiritual corruption: Jews, Bolsheviks, liberals, Christians, anyone whose existence reminded the true believers that their constructed reality was not universally accepted. The violence was not incidental to the movement but essential to it, because the maintenance of the artificial construct required the elimination of evidence that contradicted it. We observe identical patterns in communist movements. The appeal was never primarily to economic interest. Indeed, communist revolutions typically occurred in peasant societies where classical Marxist analysis suggested they should not occur. The appeal was to the promise of creating a new man liberated from the constraints of traditional consciousness, from the false consciousness that prevented people from recognizing their true interests. Again, the violence was not incidental but essential. The old consciousness had to be destroyed before the new consciousness could emerge. The bourgeoisie, the kulaks, the intellectuals, the religious believers, all had to be eliminated or re-educated because their continued existence threatened the psychological foundation of the revolutionary project. Contemporary extremisms follow precisely the same patterns, though their specific content differs. Progressive movements promise the creation of new human beings liberated from the constraints of traditional consciousness about race, gender, sexuality, and social organization. Conservative movements promise the restoration of authentic consciousness corrupted by modernist influences. Populist movements promise the recovery of genuine community consciousness obscured by elite manipulation. In each case, the movement's appeal transcends particular policy proposals. It offers participants the sense that they are engaged in the fundamental transformation of human consciousness itself, that they are the agents of historical progress toward a final resolution of the human condition. And in each case, the movement must eventually turn violent because reality persistently contradicts the artificial construct. Traditional institutions, independent sources of authority, and dissenting voices all represent threats to the movement's psychological foundation and must be eliminated or brought under control. The violence emerges not from evil intentions but from the logic of the Gnostic project itself. When you have promised to create heaven on earth through human action, anyone who questions the possibility of success becomes an enemy of salvation itself. When you have staked your entire identity on the truth of an ideological construct, anyone who provides evidence against it becomes a threat to your psychological survival. This is why extremist movements cannot be defeated through reasoned argument alone. The participants are not holding their beliefs because of evidence but despite evidence. They are maintaining artificial constructs that serve essential psychological functions, and they will defend these constructs with whatever means necessary. The only effective resistance involves the recovery of ordering symbols that provide authentic sources of meaning and orientation, symbols rooted in genuine experiences of transcendent reality rather than in human constructions. Chapter 5: The Spiritual Dimension Hidden in Plain Sight. One of the most remarkable features of our contemporary situation is how consistently we miss the spiritual dimension of political extremism, even when it operates in plain sight. We persist in treating fundamentally spiritual phenomena as if they were merely political, economic, or social, and then wonder why our responses prove inadequate. This blindness is not accidental but systematic. It results from what I call the positivist restriction of consciousness, the arbitrary limitation of attention to what can be measured, manipulated, and controlled. This restriction makes us incapable of recognizing the transcendent dimension of human existence, and therefore incapable of understanding phenomena that originate in that dimension. Observe how extremist movements consistently display characteristics that can only be understood in religious terms. They promise salvation through human action. They demand total commitment from their adherents. They provide comprehensive interpretations of reality that cannot be questioned without risking excommunication. They create sacred texts, ritual observances, and martyr cults. They divide reality into absolutely good and absolutely evil forces locked in cosmic struggle. These are not metaphorical descriptions but literal ones. Extremist movements function as religious movements, providing their adherents with ultimate meaning, transcendent purpose, and soteriological hope. The fact that they reject traditional religious language and claim to be secular only makes them more dangerous, because it obscures their true nature from both participants and observers. Consider the spiritual practices that characterize extremist participation. The regular consumption of ideological content that reinforces the group's interpretation of reality. The development of specialized vocabularies that distinguish insiders from outsiders. The cultivation of emotional states through rallies, demonstrations, and online communities. The practice of confession and mutual correction within the group. The experience of ecstasy through participation in collective action. These practices serve the same function as traditional spiritual disciplines. They transform consciousness and create powerful psychological bonds between the individual and the transcendent reality represented by the movement. The difference is that traditional spiritual disciplines aim to open consciousness to genuine transcendent reality, while ideological practices aim to close consciousness within artificially constructed pseudo-realities. The participants experience their involvement as spiritual awakening. They speak of seeing clearly, for the first time, of understanding the real truth that had been hidden from them, of feeling called to participate in something greater than themselves. They describe their conversion in language indistinguishable from religious testimony. But this apparent spiritual awakening is actually spiritual closure. Instead of opening to the mystery and complexity of reality, the participant closes himself within a systematic interpretation that claims to explain everything. Instead of cultivating humility before the transcendent, he cultivates certainty about his own righteousness. Instead of accepting the tension between temporal and eternal concerns, he believes he can achieve eternal goals through temporal action. The tragedy is that these movements appeal to authentic spiritual needs, the need for meaning, purpose, community, and transcendent orientation, but satisfy them with spiritual counterfeits that ultimately poison the soul. The participants are often the most idealistic and spiritually sensitive members of society, precisely those who most keenly feel the spiritual emptiness of contemporary life. This is why moral condemnation of extremist participants is usually ineffective and often counterproductive. They experience such condemnation as persecution that confirms their sense of righteousness. What they need is not moral instruction but spiritual therapy, the patient recovery of authentic spiritual experience that can provide genuine satisfaction for the needs they are trying to meet through ideological participation. Until we recognize that political extremism is fundamentally a spiritual disease requiring spiritual treatment, our efforts at resistance will continue to address symptoms while leaving the underlying pathology untouched. The recovery of civilizational health depends upon our ability to provide authentic spiritual alternatives to the pseudo-spiritual offerings of extremist movements. Chapter 6: Recovering the Classical Experience of Order. The path beyond the spiritual disease of political extremism lies not in the invention of new solutions but in the recovery of permanent insights about the structure of human existence that have been obscured by centuries of civilizational decline. These insights were articulated with particular clarity by the classical philosophers, who understood that authentic order emerges from the proper relationship between human consciousness and transcendent reality. The classical experience begins with the recognition that human existence unfolds within a cosmic order that extends far beyond the human realm. This order is not a human construction but a given reality within which human beings must find their proper place. The task of philosophy is to understand this order, and the task of politics is to create institutional arrangements that conform to it rather than contradicting it. Plato's great discovery was that the order of the soul and the order of society are intimately connected. A disordered soul cannot sustain just institutions, and a disordered society corrupts the souls of its members. Both individual and social health depend upon the recognition that justice is not a human invention but a transcendent principle that must be discovered rather than created. This discovery was preserved and developed through the Aristotelian analysis of the various forms of order, ethical, political, and theoretical, and their relationship to the ultimate source of order in the unmoved mover. It was further enriched through the Stoic understanding of the logos that pervades and orders the entire cosmos, and through the Christian revelation of the divine logos as the personal ground of both cosmic and historical order. What all these traditions understood, and what modernity has forgotten, is that authentic order cannot be imposed from without but must emerge from within through the proper formation of consciousness. External institutions can support or hinder this formation, but they cannot substitute for it. No amount of political engineering can create just order if the citizens themselves lack properly ordered souls. This recognition has profound implications for how we understand the relationship between individual development and social reform. The classical understanding suggests that lasting social improvement must begin with individual spiritual development, not because social conditions are unimportant, but because they depend ultimately upon the character of the human beings who create and sustain them. The practice of classical philosophy involved specific disciplines designed to order the soul through the cultivation of wisdom, courage, moderation, and justice. These were not abstract virtues but lived realities that transformed the practitioner's relationship to himself, to others, and to the cosmic order of which he was a part. Philosophy in the classical sense was therapeutic. It healed the disorders of consciousness that prevent human beings from living in accordance with their true nature. It involved the recognition that apparent goods like pleasure, wealth, power, and honor could not provide lasting satisfaction because they belonged to the realm of change and decay rather than to the realm of permanent reality. The philosopher learned to distinguish between what was up to him and what was not up to him, between what could be controlled through human action and what must be accepted as given. This distinction provided the foundation for what I call existential acceptance, the mature recognition that human fulfillment comes not from controlling external circumstances but from living consciously within the limits that define human existence. This acceptance was not passive resignation but active participation in the cosmic order through the cultivation of virtue and the pursuit of wisdom. The philosopher understood that he was called to become what he potentially was, a rational being capable of participating consciously in the divine order that sustains all reality. Contemporary recovery of this classical experience requires the recognition that the fundamental problems of human existence have not changed despite all our technological and social developments. We still face the same questions that faced Socrates: how should we live? What is the relationship between knowledge and virtue? How can we distinguish between appearance and reality? How can we order our souls so as to live in harmony with the cosmic order? These questions cannot be answered through research or analysis but only through the disciplined practice of philosophy as a way of life, the gradual transformation of consciousness through contemplative engagement with the fundamental experiences of existence. Chapter 7. Creating Islands of Order in a Sea of Disorder. The recovery of classical wisdom provides the foundation for what may be our most practical necessity, the creation of what I call islands of order within the increasing disorder of contemporary civilization. These islands represent points of resistance to the spiritual disease of extremism and centers of renewal for authentic human community. An island of order is not a physical location but a spiritual reality, a place where human beings can live consciously in proper relationship to transcendent truth despite the confusion and corruption of the surrounding culture. It is sustained not by political power or economic resources but by the quality of consciousness of its participants. The essential characteristic of such an island is the cultivation of what I term existential resistance, the capacity to maintain authentic experiences of reality against the pressure to conform to ideological constructions. This resistance requires both intellectual clarity about the nature of the spiritual disease and practical wisdom about how to live healthily within disordered circumstances. Intellectual clarity involves the ability to recognize Gnostic patterns wherever they appear, whether in apparently secular or religious movements, whether in progressive or conservative ideologies, whether in academic theories or popular movements. The Gnostic structure remains constant regardless of its particular content, the promise to eliminate existential tension through human action, the division of reality into absolute good and evil, the demand for total commitment to the movement's goals. But intellectual clarity alone is insufficient. The participant in an island of order must also cultivate practical wisdom about how to resist the psychological pressures that make extremist participation appealing. This involves the development of spiritual disciplines that provide authentic satisfaction for the needs that extremist movements exploit, the need for meaning, community, purpose, and transcendent orientation. These disciplines are not exotic practices but the fundamental activities through which human consciousness maintains its proper relationship to reality. They include the regular examination of conscience to distinguish between authentic and inauthentic motivations. The practice of contemplative reading that opens consciousness to wisdom traditions rather than closing it within ideological systems. The cultivation of friendship with others who share the commitment to truth rather than to particular opinions. Most importantly, they include what I call contemplative detachment, the capacity to care deeply about truth and justice without becoming psychologically dependent on particular outcomes. This detachment allows for passionate engagement with concrete issues while maintaining the recognition that ultimate questions cannot be resolved through political action. An island of order necessarily involves community, but not the artificial community created by shared ideology. It involves what I call existential community, the bonds that form between human beings who recognize their common participation in the mystery of existence and their common responsibility to live consciously within that mystery. Such community can exist within families, friendships, educational institutions, religious congregations, or professional associations. What makes it authentic is not its formal structure but the quality of relationship between its members, relationships characterized by mutual respect for the dignity of human existence, commitment to truth over convenience, and recognition that each person's spiritual development is ultimately his own responsibility. The members of an existential community support each other's efforts to live consciously, but they do not try to control each other's judgments or decisions. They share their insights and experiences, but they recognize that wisdom cannot be imposed from without but must be discovered by each person through his own encounter with reality. Perhaps most crucially, an island of order must maintain openness to the larger community despite its resistance to the dominant spiritual disorder. Its members cannot retreat into sectarian isolation but must continue to participate in the common life while refusing to be corrupted by it. They must find ways to be in the world but not of it, to use the classical Christian formulation. This requires what I call prudential engagement, the careful selection of battles worth fighting, the strategic use of available opportunities for constructive action, and the patient cultivation of conditions that might permit broader renewal in the future. It involves accepting that immediate large-scale transformation is not possible while working persistently for whatever improvements are achievable. The ultimate purpose of islands of order is not escape from history but preparation for renewal. They preserve and transmit the experiences of reality that must be available when the current cycle of disorder exhausts itself and populations become once again receptive to authentic wisdom. Conclusion. The spiritual disease behind political extremism cannot be cured through political means because it originates in the misguided attempt to solve spiritual problems through political action. The more we try to create perfect order through human manipulation, the more disorder we create, both in society and in our own souls. Recovery requires the recognition that authentic order emerges from the proper relationship between human consciousness and transcendent reality, a relationship that must be cultivated through spiritual discipline rather than achieved through political action. This recognition does not make us politically passive, but it properly orders our political engagement within the larger context of our existence as rational beings capable of participating in divine truth. The classical philosophers discovered that human fulfillment comes not from controlling external circumstances but from living consciously in accordance with our true nature as beings oriented toward transcendent truth. This discovery remains valid regardless of changing historical circumstances, and it provides the only reliable foundation for resistance to the spiritual disease that manifests as political extremism. Each of us must choose whether to participate in the disease or in the cure. We can contribute to the disorder by seeking escape from existential tension through ideological certainty, or we can contribute to recovery by accepting the responsibility of living consciously within the mystery of existence. The choice is not between political alternatives but between spiritual alternatives, between the Gnostic attempt to create meaning through human action and the classical acceptance that meaning is given through participation in transcendent truth. Upon this choice depends not only our individual spiritual health but the possibility of civilizational renewal in our time. The path of recovery is demanding, but it leads to authentic satisfaction rather than the endless frustration of seeking the impossible. It offers genuine hope rather than the false hope of ideological promises. Most importantly, it enables us to become agents of authentic order rather than carriers of spiritual disease.